Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I really must thank the organizers of this Congress for the invitation, in particular, of course, Professor Setsangi and Vishal Sani for all their kindness in enabling me to return to the Garden of Bliss. My talk today, Questions for Consciousness Research. Can system theory help? And let's see now. Maybe I'd better use this. There we go. To start off with, I've used this particular quotation from Gurdjieff to indicate the general theory or theme that I pursue. It really sums up my approach to the topic today. The aim is really to raise the questions about consciousness research that haven't yet, at least in my knowledge at the moment at this Congress, have not been raised, and perhaps some perspectives from system theory that may help. There is a very impressive body of research that we've heard and seen, and we've seen and heard about a number of major advances. But as I say, there are remaining questions and gaps. Oops, there we go. Just as an introductory note on what I mean by systems theory, it is the framework for modeling systems as a mathematical linear graph, showing the components and their interactions. And it's long been used, I won't say for centuries, but certainly more than half a century, to model physical systems, and particularly electrical ones. And in the early 1960s, I fiddled around and was able to generalize it to model social, economic, and environmental systems. In the late 60s, P.S. Setsangi arrived in Waterloo for doctoral work in the electrical engineering. And he actually wanted to work on socioeconomic systems. I'm sure my colleagues, with a few exceptions, such as Professor Rowe, were skeptical of that. Why would he want to do that? But he succeeded spectacularly, and over many years in India, he and his students made really quite astonishing advances. And as you know from the keynote session yesterday, he has succeeded in generalizing this theory framework to modeling the spiritual system. And I think that is an amazing achievement. Now, just a glimpse of the path or the progression of this talk. I'm going to start off with the sort of idea of basic cognition to universal cognition, or universal consciousness, cosmological consciousness, call it what you will. Looking at the quantum and the informational revolutions that have had such amazing effect. But there is also a broader systems consciousness. We've always talked about the human aspect of it, that if it's total, it's got to extend to other species, and maybe to plants. And then the whole question of realization of higher consciousness, the question of intellectual and or mystic processes and pathways. But certainly on the question of cognition, from basic cognition to the universe, we're certainly starting at the human level. And it seems to me that basic human cognition is well researched. We know a lot about it, in particular from anesthesiology, neurology, and so on. And I suppose I should, in the interest of continuity with the previous speaker here, give my own anesthesial experience. Some problems were occurring. About 14 years ago, I was lying flat, being rolled into an operation to insert 3 bypasses in my heart. It was going to be basically a conventional open heart process. And I had no problems at all. I had complete confidence that the surgeon knew his work and that the anesthetist would put me in a state where I would feel absolutely no pain. And in fact, it went well. I recovered nicely. It was in a large teaching hospital. And of course, the next day I was fortunately up in the ward already. People came through, interns, assistants, and so on. The second day, the surgeon came by and told me what he had done. He'd actually done a 4th bypass. And I said, oh, that's very well. How do you feel? And teams of doctors kept coming and asking me the same questions. How do I feel? Am I comfortable? And so on. And I was, which was very fortunate. On the 3rd day, another one came by, nice young doctor, and asked me, how do I feel? Am I comfortable? And so on. And I said, yes. I suppose I was becoming a little bit impatient and feeling quite well. I don't know why I felt a bit feisty. But then he asked me what I thought was a very strange question. And he said, did you feel anything during the operation? And I said, yeah, I felt every stroke, every cut. And he looked at me in absolute horror. And then I said to him, I'm sorry, I was just joking. I didn't feel a thing. Why did you ask? And he said, well, I was your anesthetist. And apparently I had made some sounds, some motions during the operation, had to give me some more anesthetic. So the takeaway message that I had from that experience, I'm sure Dr. Hudatz will appreciate, never tell your anesthetist any fibs. It's not a good idea. But nevertheless, one of the gaps I think that we met still in this whole conference is the question of the consciousness that occurs under hypnosis. And this was touched upon, of course, by Jim Barrell yesterday. And I think he was saying, well, how about, a little more research in this question? The other thing is, of course, what about death? What do we all know about what our consciousness, or what happens to our consciousness after death? There are many speculations, many religious beliefs, quite often radically different from one another. But how about that? I think we have not heard much of that at the moment. There's a question, of course, about a genetic factor in the, in a sense, ability to reach a higher level of consciousness. And there is a certain amount of research that has identified the so-called VMA2 protein. VMAT stands for vesicular monoamine transporter. And apparently people that have this gene, they have increased ability to, in effect, a greater dose of dopamine, serotonin, and so on, that enhances the ability of their brain to attain that higher consciousness. Because it's an amazing thing that we have heard about the structure, shall we say, of the consciousness-forming elements of our brain. It's not just that the adult human brain has something like anywhere between 100 and 500 trillion synapses. Even the brain of an infant has maybe 1 trillion synaptic connectors. It's incredible to think that during gestation, a fetus has to be creating these brain cells at something like 250,000 per minute. And if we think of the question of that's the neuronal cells that have a much highly differentiated structure in themselves, it's quite mind-boggling, I think, when we look at the level of the microtubule and so on, up to the cell, up to the brain, up to the human being, etc. It's quite spectacular. But the thing is, how consciousness develops is one question. What humans do with it is another. And I think we have to look at the question, not only is there a genetic base to spirituality, but how does it develop through social learning? Presumably, parents and the family instill, or in part somehow, various skills, shall we say, various bits of information to an infant that prepares it to, in effect, function in the society in which the individual is growing up. But what about their spiritual practices? What about positive and negative influences, and so on? How do these, and how can these be studied in a systems perspective? If I had another lecture here, I would go into a whole society, environment, system concept that would look at the values and beliefs of the society, its structure, the parameters and possibilities of the environment, and so on. But we won't do that today. But it's definitely an area of questioning that is susceptible to being looked at in a systems theory perspective. Now, when we get to the whole question of cosmological consciousness, here we're seeing a cosmic level of consciousness. Is this the prime force? Is this a causation of our universe, or of our universes? If you're a multiverse type of person, I think this is a question about, yes, there is a level of consciousness that is accessible to humans, and it's all-encompassing, and it may actually be that force. The question, though, is where did it all come from? And of course, we know that the early Vedic and Buddhist concepts have been around for literally thousands of years. In the West, the ideas came much later. One of the interesting writers was Richard Buck, whose book in 1901 called Cosmic Consciousness, a study in the evolution of the human mind, did posit a three-level spectrum of consciousness. He had the normal one of human consciousness, which he labeled as self-consciousness. There was below it a level of animal consciousness, and above it, a higher level, which he did call cosmic consciousness, but he saw that as a level for future development. Buck was, I have to get a patriotic plug in here somewhere. He was a Canadian. He lived most of his formative years not too far from Waterloo, Ontario, in a town called London. not London, England, but London, Ontario, which is halfway between Toronto and Detroit. And he did much of his work at the University of Western Ontario Medical School. He was a psychiatrist most of the time. Good thing he wrote his book in 1901, because almost exactly 111 years ago now, he met a rather typical Canadian accident that ended his life. He came out his door on a winter's day, slipped on a patch of ice, fell very heavily on his head, went unconscious, and died the same day. So there are disadvantages to living in Canada during the winter. Russian mystic philosophers, particularly Gurdjieff and his disciple Fyodor Uspensky, also felt that man must use different tools to form a higher logic. In other words, to attain cosmic consciousness, you have to definitely work at it. He had a process which he outlined in the book Tertianum Organum, which some of you probably have read. Now, Buck, Buck maintained that those who had cosmic consciousness were gifted and self-disciplined. So maybe he didn't say anything about genetics. I'm not sure how much they knew about that in those days. But nevertheless, that were the two aspects that he felt were important. But today, and also I think in the East, the whole question of gifts doesn't seem to be quite as important as the discipline and the spiritual practicing and love in order to form a process of enhancing consciousness and reaching higher levels, if not cosmic, at least higher levels of consciousness. So let's take a look at some of the information and quantum revolutions. Quantum concepts, I think, have really revolutionized how we see and visualize the world, and also how we see consciousness. The whole question is, let's say, absolutely breathtaking. If we look at the whole question of how it's developing, we're into now quantum computing. We're into quantum information science. We're into quantum field theory, string theory, and even quantum gravity theory. We don't yet have a theory of quantum ice cream, but we may well soon. Some researchers have found that our brains function very similar to what they believe a quantum computer should function. And some others have gone so far as to contend that the universe is a quantum computer. Now, how do we prove or disprove that? That's one of the questions that I can't answer. But the question, I think, of dependency has arisen here in this conference, and I don't have an answer for it. I'm sorry. I hope some of you may have one at some time. But does the concept of our universe depend on its presence? Does consciousness perceive reality, or does it depend on it? Did consciousness emerge through evolution, or was it always out there in existence? In other words, if the consciousness of each one of us emerged from the neurons, the microtubular structure that we, in effect, grew in the womb and then developed when we're walking around on planet Earth and so on. Is that where it came from? Or what? Where is our soul? Is our soul and our consciousness one and the same thing? Or is it, are they not? Are they separate? If so, which one goes out the window when we die? Or both? Questions, questions, questions. The whole thing of information, I should have said, how about consciousness being considered rational, is it? But look at information. Is information consciousness, or is it not? Or is it an aspect of consciousness, a descriptor of consciousness? Now, the information explosion, revolution, and so on, is almost a cliche these days. But I'm sure that many of you have seen the rather amazing statistic that was developed, of course, on the west coast of California, that the information contained in all the words that were ever spoken or written by humankind from the beginning of time to the year 1991 was something like 5 exabytes. There are people that dispute that actual number, but nevertheless, is that a lot of information? Well, 1 exabyte is 1,000,000 terabytes. Now, if you think of the largest library in the world, that's the United States Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. If they were able to put all of their print materials, all the words in that whole dictionary, that would be about 10 terabytes. And a terabyte, you can get a device not much larger than this little phone for a reasonable price in the shop that'll hold 1 terabyte. And I could get 10 of those and have the whole Library of Congress in my Congress bag. I would need 1,000,000 of them, though, to go together to get an exabyte. Now, in the year 2000, the same group did a study of that 1 year, all the information processed or created in that year in the world. Another 5 exabytes were produced in that year alone. The rate of growth is now so high that some people estimate that by 2020, we will be producing 5 exabytes. Now, wait for it. Anybody want to guess how long it'll take? Well, it's coming. Every 10 minutes. Now, what's in that information content? Well, of course, it's all kinds of stuff that's come from the internet. It may be digitized output from the Hubble telescope in high outer space. It may be the information to conduct an open heart operation, not an open heart, but a heart operation with the so-called keyhole method, thousands of miles from where the surgeon is actually located. It may be millions of YouTube videos of cats playing with balls of string, or my grandparents' Facebook accounts and images of the parties they're at, and so on. A lot of it isn't, I don't know, it's maybe not really communicative information, but how much it, anyway. But the information already has revolutionized every discipline of research, and whether it's contributed to our higher level of consciousness or no, I wouldn't venture to say. But nevertheless, we should take a look at it. Now, a broader systems consciousness, that's what I call a systems consciousness. Hopefully, it'll be possible to study it scientifically and empirically. I think we're on the road here in this conference. There may be doubt that it will ever be subject to rational analysis, that everyone will not dispute, but it still has concentrated on human consciousness, maybe because it appears that it's the only form of consciousness that is truly cosmic, but it does leave out the question of non-human cosmic consciousness. What do I mean by that? Well, one axiom is, I take it that all living entities have some form of consciousness, and that their form of consciousness is an integral part of the universal. Now, I'm not sure how systems theory can help in this conundrum, but I would like to present a few examples of the variety of non-human forms and so on. Aboriginal totemism. This is probably one of the most, the most fundamental spiritual belief that existed in the world. Almost every Aboriginal society has or had in their pre-contact era that there was some totem animal or several of them that could be their spiritual conduit to a universal force or spirit. They called it by different names, whether it was Manitou or Oloku or whatever, but they felt that an animal could lead them to that spirit. And they usually felt that they couldn't get their message through themselves. Perhaps a shaman could do it, but not they themselves. The totem animals were mentors, they were protectors, they were guides in their daily life, and they were delineators of the group identity. In other words, if you were in the Bear Clan, you were different somehow from people in the Eagle Clan. You would do things differently and so on. You have a different life experience. And some Aboriginals also hold inanimate objects as sacred. Oh, does a rock have consciousness? I don't know, but can we rule it out? Think of Uluru in Australia. Or maybe it was a so-called power site. This is common in Mexico, South and Central America. Sometimes a special water body, a spring, for instance, or a lake would be seen as having some kind of sacred connection to the higher spirit. Now, can we conclusively conclude that so-called inanimate objects have no consciousness whatsoever? I don't know. Possibly. We do. But let's look at the actual species, and I don't mean domesticated species, because whatever cosmic consciousness they had at one time is probably bred out of them. But everybody who's looked at a flock of birds, even if they're just not migrating, but just gracefully flying up from one tree over to another in hundreds of them, or shoals of fishes. You can see in videos, let's say, of the Great Barrier Reef and so on, thousands of fishes that move almost as one. Flocks of birds. What herds of animals? Well, what mechanism triggers these synchronized movements? What motivates their group patterns? Even it may be maybe as big a pattern of activity as migration, or it may simply be a very almost a joyous movement pattern in a local area over a short time. Now, for instance, is in migrating species, is it really just, the ability to find the magnetic, as it were, lines of force from the Earth's magnetism to navigate? Or maybe they only look at changing lengths of that? Or is it something else, something bigger? Is there an intrinsic connection with the cosmos and with each other through some form of collective? Maybe it's a slice of the cosmic consciousness or a region in it. Clearly it's not of the same dimension as human, but is it not worth studying and wondering about? Here's the storks, the white storks in Europe. They're huge birds. Typically they'll have a wingspan over 2 meters. Now they migrate not en masse, mostly in onesie, twosies, maybe 3 or 4 at once, from summer areas where they breed in northern areas to winter areas thousands of kilometers away in Africa, Middle East, and so on. Yet it's not unusual for a breeding pair to return to exact same nest. Not all of them do, but many of them do. And they know this from banding the birds to identify exactly which individual is who and where and when. Another one is the crane, the Eurasian crane. They're even bigger, and they do migrate and congregate in large groups. It's not unusual to see over 100 of them in a V form. At this time of year, they're migrating. They've already arrived, a few of them, in northern Germany. They also migrate thousands of kilometers, and while they're flying in formation, they're talking to one another. They're communicating. So, hey, sweet, sweet. We don't understand what they're talking about, but you can hear them, even if they're 10,000 feet up in the air. And they congregate for free feeding and protection in the same small areas every year. Now, you don't need a big bird necessarily. The cranes that are typically 5 or even 6 kilograms, hummingbirds, the ruby-throated hummingbird, they only weigh 3 or 4 grams. Their wingspan is 10 centimeters. It's about like that. Yet they can migrate also individually thousands of kilometers from vast areas in the eastern U.S. and Canada to wintering areas in Central America and southern Mexico. And a few of them, I guess they're the foolish ones, I don't know, they don't necessarily follow a route over the land. Some of them migrate by flying over the entire Gulf of Mexico, which is about 800 kilometers, nonstop. Where do they get the energy in a 3-gram bird to do that? I don't know. But even more astounding, butterflies. The monarch butterfly ranges over a huge area, but they winter in only a few very localized areas in Mexico and California. And when I mean localized, I mean smaller. The ones in California are typically, there are 3 or 4 of them, are 2 to 5 acres in size. Just 1 or 2 hectares. The ones in Mexico are a little bigger. They may be a few square kilometers, but they're not large. But incredibly, no single individual makes the entire trip. Huh? During the migrations, the female monarchs deposit eggs to create a next generation. When the first generation arrives in the summer, when they hatch, their lifespan is typically a couple of months, maybe 3 at the most. But the ones that emerge later, they may have a lifespan of about 7 months. But nevertheless, they have to have extra eggs so that somebody else can carry on this one cycle of migration? How about that? There's no explanation that I have heard for this strategy or how the next generation learns how to continue the journey to those same trees. It's unbelievable. Here's a picture of the upper picture shows the monarch butterflies, the colorful things, congregating in thousands upon individual trees in California. If you ever visit the Naval College in Pacific Grove, California, in the fall, you can see them. In October and November, they start to congregate there. And if you can see this lower map, it's actually animated. I'm sure that, unfortunately, I should have put it higher. But it shows the actual migrating patterns from California and Mexico and so on. Now, okay, there's some kind of species consciousness, I believe, that connects many animals. But what about plants? Well, there are a lot of science fair high school students and so on who've had a project to show how plant growth can be affected by music or by other sounds and things like that. A lot of these projects seem to have been successful. There's a lot of skepticism. Plant scientists say, well, there's too many variables, there's too much of a placebo effect, so on. Some people believe in a mystical sense that there must be some kind of effect. It's well reported that Prince Charles talks to the plants in his garden and issues them instructions as to how they should grow. But others say, well, scientifically, there's no reason why plants should be affected by music. But on the other hand, just recently, the University of Bristol, their School of Biological Sciences, published the results of a 3-year study they had done of about 200 bees and their patterns of gathering nectar from petunias. They found that the blossoms actually emit little tiny electrical signals that tell the bees, okay, I have some pollen for you. Not only that, they reduce the voltage when they say, sorry, fellow, the last bee got all my pollen. You can fly along to the next blossom. Effectively enabling a communication link to enhance the relationship and the advertising power, if you like, between the bees and the blossoms. Now, systems consciousness. How do we get to it? Where is it? Now, can systems consciousness, including human and non-human, be understood as a system? That's the first question. Can system theory help? I know you've been wanting that answer, and I didn't give it at the start, so it's here. Maybe. I don't honestly know how, but I think the perspective has a lot of promise, and I believe the main promise lies in a so-called one system concept. I think a one system concept entails that there is only one system. We're all interconnected to it. It's not only our Earth that is part of a solar system, that's part of a galaxy, that's part of a universe that may or may not be one of a string of 11, or that maybe is in a universe created by one big bang that's going to be followed by many others, and was preceded by others. The fact that all of our environmental systems are connected to one another, I think is quite evident. but that is, I think, an important thing. The concept that there is only one system can be taught. Goodness knows, in environmental studies programs, I have tried to teach that, and the success rate is not by any means 100%, but it's somewhere in probably the low teens, which is probably better than a lot of others. And I believe that meditative and spiritual processes are likely the surest way to enhance consciousness. There may be, however, a prior step that anyone can intellectually absorb and profit by. And if they did, I think millions and billions of consciousness people would lead to quite a bit of improvement in a better world for this earth. I think the main lesson really is the world would be a better place if all of you would join me in the following realization. And the first one is there is only one system. The second, there is only one system. The third is there is only one system. To conclude, we should be aware of this comment, quote, from Margaret Mead. Never underestimate the power of a few committed individuals or highly spiritually developed individuals to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has done so. Mahatma Gandhi said, "We must be the change we wish to see." So, thank you for being